Now it's time for preview 14B. In the next preview assignment and in the next class, you will need to be able to identify different types of bias. I know in our last lesson, I knew it was going to do it today. Okay. In our last lesson, we talked some about bias in study, design, and in implementation. So let's talk more about bias. Make sure you're making note that bias occurs when some flaw in the design or implementation of a study results in a tendency for measurements to be inaccurate representations of the population. Whew, that's a lot for bias. Bottom line, flaws, inaccuracies, something's going on. There are several types of bias, and you will explore some of them in this worksheet. One that we need to write down, response bias. It asks us to look up this definition and state the definition below in our own words. As always, this whole semester, I need you to pause. I need you to work on these questions by yourself before you just listen to the video. After you have some answers down, then come on back. So this time you might want to complete questions 1, 2, and 3, and then come back and let's talk through them together. So to begin with, on question 1, response bias. Response bias occurs when participants respond inaccurately, and I don't know that I can write that fast, so I'll just talk slowly. Whenever participants respond inaccurately or falsely. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. Inaccurately or falsely to questions. It could also occur when there are problems with the measurement system that is being used, or when somehow the researchers influence the responses. Next, we have selection bias. So even go over these in your mind. We're talking about bias. The first one was response bias. The second one that we're going to talk about is selection bias. Selection bias is when data are gathered in a way that leaves out some representatives of the population. The study has selection bias because the sample was not obtained randomly. Finally, we're going to look at non-response bias. A possible definition for non-response bias is that in sampling with a survey, some individuals that are chosen for the sample are unwilling or unable to participate in the survey. Non-response bias might result, especially if there is some sort of difference between those who did respond and those who chose to not respond. This is a great time to hit pause. Go ahead and look at questions 4 and beyond, and then come back and let's walk through 4. In question 4, a researcher decides to conduct a survey about the cost of college tuition just before 8 a.m. Let that one soak in, college and just before 8 a.m. The researcher stands on the sidewalk near the science building and hands out 4,000, that's awesome, surveys to students. At the bottom of the survey, there are instructions for students to snail mail back the completed survey, and that's very good. The researcher's address is listed. Part A, so what types of students might the researcher miss by handing out the survey during this time of day? And since the researcher is handing out the surveys early in the morning, not everybody takes early classes, a lot of different types of students could be missed. She might miss students who work during the day and take classes at night. She might also miss students who take classes online since they don't even go up to the campus to take classes. Continuing on in question 4, part B, what types of students might the researcher miss by handing out surveys in this location? Since the researcher is handing out the surveys near the science building, she may only see the students who are taking science classes that specific term. Part C, do you think that all 4,000 surveys will be filled out and mailed back? Why or why not? All 4,000, do you think they're going to be mailed back? Well, probably not. Probably some of the surveys are going to get thrown away as soon as they get to the parking garage or parking lot or the building itself. College students do not use snail mail very often, and they might not even have any stamps, and that's an additional step, and they're not going to mess with it. They are more likely to get a text. They're more likely to text than to mail something. And also, there's no incentive to return the survey. So part D, are there examples of response bias, selection bias, or possibly non-response bias in this example? So, yes, there is selection bias because the sample was not obtained randomly. There's also non-response bias because some who were given the survey may not even return it. So finally, on question E, what is one way that the researcher could try to increase the chance of people returning the survey? The surveyor, the researcher could offer an incentive, like a coupon for pizza or for ice cream if you return the survey. The researcher could have those students who return the survey fill out a ticket that would later be placed in a drawing, and then one lucky winner would win a $50 gift certificate. The survey could be delivered in a different manner, like through online or text, and the survey could be shorter if it happens to be somewhat lengthy. If you haven't already completed question 5, please pause here, go work on question 5, and then come back. A passage from the survey described in question 4 reads, the in-state tuition at our school, the College of William and Mary, is 59% lower than tuition at Harvard, and it is 61% lower than tuition at Yale. Would you support a 7% tuition increase to maintain programs and services at our college? Are there examples of response, selection, or non-response bias in this situation, and explain? Well, we have a really good situation here of response bias. The question should be neutral. It should not lead the respondent to answer in a certain way or even have the potential to lead the respondent in a certain way. If you haven't answered question 6, please pause, and this would even be a great time to answer questions 6 and 7 and then come back and work through this with me. Another interviewer asked questions face-to-face. Oh my. In the middle of a busy bookstore. In one question, students are asked if they currently have illegal drugs in their dorm rooms. Part A, do you think all the students are going to answer that question honestly? Why or why not? I would say no. Students who do have illegal drugs are not going to admit to having them. They are very particularly unlikely to answer this type of question, especially in a busy bookstore where there are many people around who could overhear their conversation. So part B, would you consider this an example of response bias, selection bias, or non-response bias in this situation, and explain? Well, there may be selection bias because the sample was not obtained randomly. There also could be response bias because some of the students might answer the question dishonestly to protect themselves. There could also be non-response bias, especially with those who, well, because people may not choose to answer this question in a public forum or anywhere, especially if they actually do have illegal drugs in their dorm room, leading to even to the uneven exclusion, of certain subgroups. So finally, we're wrapping it all up. Looking at question 7, identify the following examples as either response bias, selection bias, or non-response bias. Part A. An interviewer went to a construction site and interviewed the workers about their workload. Some individuals had too much work to do, so they did not have time to answer the questions. The interviewer concluded that the people of the construction site did not have a large workload. This is a great example of non-response bias. Part B. A researcher is interested in the extent of sexually transmitted diseases on campus. In a busy college courtyard, an interviewer asked students if they've ever been diagnosed with a sexually transmitted disease. But none of the students answered yes. Could there be an example of bias? Yes. The responses are not accurate. Finally, in the wealthiest neighborhood in the city, a researcher knocked on doors and asked people who they would vote for in the upcoming election for mayor. The researcher concluded that candidate X is going to be very likely elected mayor. Is there some type of bias? And the answer is yes. This is not a representative sample of this population who are going to elect the mayor. It is selection bias. This does conclude our lesson 14B. You need to check your syllabus to see if there are more lessons for this week. Keep going if there are, and I'll see you next week if there are not.